everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, joined by Soren Shade. Soren, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Joe. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's been a while since we've caught up.
Yeah, so really pumped. We're going to get into a favorite topic and I think a helpful topic for us to discuss as it helps illustrate all sorts of fun things related to the psychedelic scene. And we're going to talk plenty about psychedelics too. But Soren, you're one of the co-founders at Top Tree Herb. You sent me this awesome bottle and some samples a bunch of months ago. Been working through it, and I like it. Teabag Kratom. I guess, how do we pronounce it if we want to start there?
That's a great place to start. So there is a Malaysian professor, one of the leading researchers of the plant Kratom or Kratom. The scientific name of the tree is Mitragina speciosa, and it's situated throughout Southeast Asia. The Kratom culture is centered around Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so Darshan Singh, one of the leading Malaysian Kratom researchers, his big thing is that the American pronunciation, which we've been using, Kratom, is just kind of a bastardization of what the close to what the original pronunciation is. And so I'm going to kind of bastardize the original, but it's closer to Kratom. And so in English, the non-pretentious way of staying close to that true pronunciation is Kratom. But I had an instance where I was asking Dr. Hart in class a question about Kratom, and I raised
Dr.
my hand.
Carl Hart, our favorite at Columbia. Keep going, sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm kind of jumping in the middle of a couple different little storylines here, but I asked him a question about Kratom. I think it was relating to its special pharmacodynamic effect at the opioid receptor in relation to classical opiates. And the question I was really shocked by, because it seemed like it wasn't registering. But then my friend Sam, who was sitting beside me, eventually went, Kratom. And Hart just went, yes. And then he fell into it. So whenever I'm talking to people about Kratom in the United States, I used to, for a very long time, kind of put my foot down and be Kratom. But now it's just, for the sake of pragmatism, Kratom. And I don't really think any pronunciation is wrong so much as meaningful information is passed back and forth and people can have a conversation on it. But if you kind of like to show your heightened understanding of the plant, you could probably start calling it Kratom and either be looked at as pretentious or scholarly.
That's great. So I guess let's talk a little bit about you. Like, where do you come from, and how did you kind of find this interesting plant, and maybe even more interestingly, in the classroom with Dr. Carl Hart?
Yeah. So that's I guess in a little background, we should start at the beginning. I was raised on a 6th-generation family farm, which is really just a plot of wilderness in the foothills of Appalachia here in West Virginia. And I was raised without television, without siblings. My parents worked in town 7 days a week. And so I was left a lot of my childhood when I was in school running around in nature, in the woods. And I really developed an appreciation for plants and animals there. And then I came to an appreciation of, there being a rigorous body of study for almost every plant and every animal that you come across. And that if you just learn the name of it, suddenly there is a whole world of knowledge available to you over the internet, in the library, whatever. And that, I think, really kind of opened my eyes and to appreciate the natural world. And then I got very lucky, and I got a low income scholarship to Columbia University my senior year of high school, and I was able to get out of West Virginia, which isn't something that many people in my town end up doing. So I'm very lucky and fortunate in that. And I got to Columbia University, and I started off in neuroscience, thinking that that would be how I would get into the interesting questions of consciousness that fascinated me at the time. And my freshman year, I asked just like a neuroanatomy professor a question about free will, and he just shut me down and said, "Wrong class, buddy. Wrong department, man. You got to go to the philosophy class for that." And so I switched from neuroscience to philosophy my freshman year at Columbia, and out of an interest of studying consciousness. And that interest in consciousness eventually took me to the Amazon between my junior and senior years. I was originally supposed to work with Eric Erie. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who wrote for a West Virginia magazine, and he broke the story in 2016 about the pill mills of West Virginia, some of the early opioid epidemic coverage that was coming out at the time. And he ended up getting sacked because the owner of the newspaper he wrote for was a major investor in an opioid pharmaceutical company. And so the one Pulitzer Prize winning journalist in West Virginia could no longer find work as a journalist in West Virginia. A story as old as time. And I ended up linking up with a family friend former editor of High Times, anthropologist, author, Peter Gorman. He just recently passed about 3 months ago, but I hooked up with Peter, and he took these yearly jaunts to the Amazon to visit with this indigenous Motzes tribe that he made contact with as one of the first white people in the 80s, following a Peruvian Motzes territorial dispute in which Peru essentially just firebombed and massacred about 80% of this tribe. And then he went into the jungle, he met with them, and then he was the first white person to experience the drug effect of applying the secretion of the Phylomedusa bicolor, also known as sapo or cambo venom, into your arm, where you have these burns and scars, and you get this multi-compound mediated effect that's been used for a very, very long time among the tribal people. And he got some notoriety for this discovery, and he wrote about it in High Times and Omni magazine. But he's been going back yearly pretty much since the 80s, since he meant that. And so I went with him, and I had some utterly mind-boggling psychedelic experiences and other jungle medicine mediated experiences down there. And I came back to Columbia, with even deeper ingrained fascination in consciousness, but one that kind of brought me full circle back to an appreciation of the neuroscientific effect of consciousness and how it can be mediated through drugs. And so that semester, when I got back for my senior year, I enrolled in Dr. Carl Hart's class, among other study of consciousness and neuroscience courses. And that really kind of kicked off what is today my obsession with drug-mediated novel states of consciousness, and ultimately that relationship with prohibition, politics, and society. And I don't really consider myself to be a psychedelic advocate or a kratom advocate or a cannabis advocate, despite wearing those hats a lot. I consider myself to be more of an anti-prohibitionist, and anywhere I can lean into being broadly anti-prohibitionist in the most pragmatic sense possible is what I jump into. So I don't want to just keep rambling, but yeah, Dr. Carl Hart kind of kicked me off with that, the
Do you think
expertise.
the Carl Hart argument is about like one of the best anti-prohibition arguments Are there others that you've loved as well?
I think that a convincing argument, you know, needs to have some sort of facts and data that are accessible to everyone, generally through an empirical lens rather than just a belief mediated lens. So, you could believe that drugs are bad, and that they're going to cause the downturn in society. But then if you really dig into statistics or toxicological data regarding the effects of drugs on an individual and society at large, that argument kind of starts to unwind. And it's really only rhetoric and belief that keeps that argument alive. Whereas people like Dr. Carl Hart, people like Hamilton Morris, so these mentors of mine, they really focus on the science, on reproducibility, on peer-reviewed evidence for the claims that they make regarding the lack of toxicity in common recreational doses of these drugs, the lack of, societal turmoil that results from substances being introduced in there, or divorcing that from a broader context of industry change or demographic migrations and shifts in an area, and saying that it's not the drug that's specifically responsible for these effects, and that you might want to look a little bit broader. So kind of to summarize, Dr. Hart's argument is, look at the science, don't make any claim without first having done basic experiments on the facts. And that's some of the stuff that's really fascinating about Carl Hart, is that he doesn't do really complicated scientific work. Like, some of his most impressive, most influential research has been things like, we have 5 milligrams of amphetamine, we have 5 milligrams of methamphetamine, or we have $5 or $20, and then you randomize the amphetamine or the methamphetamine, and you bring long-term users of amphetamine, self-prescribed users of amphetamine, into a room, and then you offer them, hey, would you like a little bit of meth, or would you like $20? And something like a significant amount, it's been a while since I've returned to this paper, but a significant amount of them would take the money before they would the methamphetamine, which really just kind of destroys the argument that if you are addicted, which is again like a wormhole of a discussion to go into, what does addiction mean? But if you are addicted to methamphetamine, you can't think of anything outside the realm of immediately getting your fix, where it turns you into this zombified, inhuman, meth-seeking creature with no logic or rational capacity of thought left. And it's Carl Hart's just very easily kind of destroyed this Reagan-based prohibitionist theory that, no, in fact, people who use drugs still have a capacity for rational thought. And it's that kind of research, which is incredibly simple, that just
Hold the press.
just
Right.
opens up a lot of like a lot of holes in the dominant prohibitionist propaganda that has seeped into the psychology of not just Americans, but after Nixon's re-election campaign in the 70s, it just, every Western country, aside from like some South American countries which still have legal plant psychedelics, the whole world just accepted this Nixonian drug propaganda as fact, and it hasn't really been questioned since then.
Yeah. I would love to dig into the history of that eventually. Like, how did the United States empire like force that down into like the legal infrastructure worldwide? And then nobody even really thought twice
Yeah.
at that, international level. It's kind of wild. Anyway, let's dig in. So how did you find this magical plant? Like, did it just kind of show up one day? Were you kind of in pain, or what happened there?
It appeared to me in a dream. No. So this was my sophomore year at Columbia. I was just in my dorm with my roommate, and we had just gotten into watching this TV show on Vice called Hamilton's Pharmacopeia, and we were just going through it episode by episode. So, interestingly enough, my introduction to Kratom was watching Hamilton's fantastic Vice documentary on it from early 2017. Right around the time it came out is when I saw it, and I just went over to a corner store and bought some capsules, and you know, played around with it. Probably took me a couple months to really figure out what it was it did, what worked for me. But then I pretty quickly fell into a routine where I was, taking coffee one day, or caffeine, and then using Kratom the next, just as a study aid to help me with my productivity. Because I had caffeinated my way through my freshman year, and I was en route to, break my records for caffeine milligrams per day records day after day my sophomore year, chugging down 6 cups of coffee a day, having many side effects related to caffeine, insomnia, excess sweating, irritability, just the classic overstimulated side effects. And once I introduced myself to Kratom, I just very quickly reduced my tolerance to coffee, because I was able to have the same focus and attention boost with Kratom as I would with caffeine. And then jumping from coffee one day, Kratom the next, my tolerance for both stayed very low, and the effective dose didn't really jump around much at that point. And I've been sold really ever since then. I've kind of stuck to that regimen. I'm not dogmatic in how I take any things, and I break routine a lot. Sometimes I'll have both one day if I'm looking for more than just attention, an attention boost. But that's really what
So
started
we chatted
my
a
interest
while
in it.
ago, Soren, like this, a lot of the consumption of Kratom is like just the plant material raw in pills,
Hmm.
or somebody makes just like a raw sludge and just drinks it. Can you
Yeah.
can you speak to like what the problems are with that, and like why we see some negative effects?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, that's how I was introduced to Kratom as well. That's in New York City. There are a bunch of kava kratom bars. If you're going to drink Kratom through them, every single one in New York that I've been to is this slurry of hot water and this micronized powder of the kratom leaf. And really, the logic behind that is shipping leaves from Indonesia, which is the major exporter of kratom, to the United States, involves a massive global shipping route, and these shipping containers. And you want to optimize, for economic purposes, how much product you can get over in one time. And so you dehydrate, and then you pulverize the leaf into a powder in order to efficiently pack it and ship it. And so when it gets to the United States, people really don't have that cultural, social legacy of kratom use around them. They don't have a grandmother who says, this is how you chew kratom or brew kratom tea, as you would in Thailand or Indonesia. You don't have friends who are consuming it in a responsible manner. You're just kind of on your own to figure it out. I need to consume this to get the effect. And that was the position I was in. And so I was, swallowing kratom capsules, and it was still positive enough for me to want to keep using it. But what I'd learned, since consuming it that way, was that in the likely 1,000-year traditional use of kratom as a folk medicine throughout Southeast Asia, no one really ever swallowed the leaf. It's either picked fresh from a tree, chewed on, kind of like a quid of tobacco. You let the juices, the polyphenolic compounds, the alkaloids, everything absorb in the mucous membrane under the tongue, and you get in your bloodstream that way, and then you spit out and discard the leaf matter within a minute of having rolled it up, put it in your mouth. Or they pick a whole bunch of them, put them in a pot, and do a low simmer over a fire for 3 hours, and strain it and drink it that way, again discarding the leaf matter. And in the United States, you have people complaining that they love Kratom, they love the effect, but gives them nausea or they vomit having taken too much. And that's because more than likely you're swallowing grams and grams of an insoluble plant fiber that's never really been swallowed before. And then going even further, in the United States, you have kratom being in this, or kratom being in this weird regulatory gray zone where people can import it, say this is not for human consumption, and then get away with selling non-sterilized, possibly contaminated, possibly heavy metal impregnated powder that's going to have deleterious health effects as a result of things that are not kratom being swallowed with the kratom powder. And it was really that eureka moment of oh wow, so much can be solved in terms of reducing the possible negative effects of kratom consumption simply by returning to a more traditional manner of consumption through aqueous tea bag extractions. And that was the impetus for our founding of Top Tree Herbs, which is more or less a company hinged upon kratom tea bags as a product, with the overall mission of just trying to educate people on a plant that helps millions every single day, but who are kind of, stretching their arms out in the dark, trying to feel around territory that hasn't really been elucidated much in the media. You really got to do some deep digging and kind of get to these niche corners of the internet that Hamilton lives on to really get kind of answers to what kratom is, how people have been using it, and just the facts about it. So that's the mission of Top Tree Herbs, is to just educate. We're not diminishing, kratom toss and washing. If that works for you, if for whatever reason you prefer to swallow the kratom powder, go for it. Our mission is really just to educate, to talk about it, and try to normalize what is otherwise a rather enigmatic plant here in the United States.
Why is it so political?
Oh, well, in the United States,
you can ask me that question first, and then we can dig in.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I was going to ask.
To pour myself a cup right now.
Oh, good. Had you heard of Kratom prior to our first discussion on it, or tried it?
I had not tried it. I had heard of it. I had, I don't really recall what I knew at that point in time, but I remember hearing things like, some people were taking like really crazy macro doses of it on the regular. I remember hearing things like people were using it to help them detox from opiates. I had not really heard of the use case of like self-treating chronic pain, which I find really interesting, being a chronic pain person myself. So that's about the extent of it. And, just another plant getting kind of thrashed in the media saying this should be illegal. Like, what? Okay, this has my attention now. And then we spoke like maybe, honestly, like 3 years after that. And that was kind of like my baseline understanding.
Yeah. That's kind of like the bat signal for, whoa, maybe there's something interesting here. Maybe there's something that's not being said when something is getting, without debate, solely bad attention through the typical, media sphere, through news outlets. It's just, all right, here's a plant, everyone's hating on it. Seen that before. Ever since, the early New York Times articles from 1914, titled, and this is a big talking point for Dr. Carl Hart, There were newspaper articles. 1914, New York Times talked about the Negro cocaine fiend, and the argument was that Black people in the South were using cocaine, getting superhuman strength, and were invulnerable to the bullets that the police in the South used at the time, which did two things. It, made people more afraid of Black people. It put a lot of pressure to criminalize and make illegal cocaine, which at that time, fell within, this weird snake oil medicine category that existed prior to advent of federal regulations and medicines and supplements. And it also caused police to increase the caliber of their bullets that they kept on their waist. So it's just, lies from the get-go in American history regarding talking about drugs and plants. And, Kratom really squarely falls within that tradition. But why is Kratom so political? It also kind of relates to that, the history of drug prohibition and being shit on by the media, like cocaine and cannabis and heroin and psychedelics. But Kratom today is a bit of a controversial plant. You're absolutely right about that. And the exact reason is kind of elucidated by a number of conspiracies that are, floating around. And I don't really want to get into the conspiracy of why perhaps the FDA might have cause for benefiting from Kratom being made illegal, or why certain industries might see more profits if Kratom were made illegal. Not just pharmaceutical, but also natural products, big turmeric, big cannabis. There's just conspiracies floating around, and there's probably truth, within all of them to some degree. But I think there's a good story from history that kind of can help us reflect on what's going on today a little bit better. And Thailand in the 1930s, 40s was part of the new and emerging, or at that point, I guess rather 100-year-old, the golden triangle of opiate production from India to China to Thailand, out to the Western world. And it was opiates, opium at that time was a taxed legal product that a majority of the Thai population was consuming on a regular basis. And there are estimates that something like 20 to 30, maybe even higher percentage of the Thai tax revenue every year was coming from this opium tax. Then 1942, wow. 1943 comes around, and Japan invades China. There's war in Europe, and Thailand gets strong-armed to joining World War II as an Axis power. And now there's conscription, now there's war taxes, and everyone's belts gets a little bit tighter. People's wallets are a little bit lighter, and the amount of free money that people have to pay taxes on opium to maintain their taxes, drops rapidly. And within a year, you see that suddenly there's hardly anything coming in regards to tax revenue from opium. There's an investigation. The parliament in Thailand, some of the police commissioners look into it, and they say very openly in public access records that people are not paying their opium taxes, which is crucial to the war effort, because they have started using this traditional folk medicine instead. So people were chewing kratom leaves or drinking kratom tea, and they had no cravings for the opiates that they had been using on a regular basis as a result of that. And since there were literal forests of kratom trees and hundreds of years of traditional knowledge regarding how to properly and safely use kratom, this was a seamless, painless switch for almost everyone in the population. And so in 1943, the Thai government makes Kratom illegal in order to try to get their opioid revenue back up to where it was to assist in the war effort. The law was kind of half enforced up until the second prohibitionist push led by America happened in the 70s. And in that case, Thailand chopped down every single kratom tree that grew on its peninsula, aside from there's about a several hundred acre national forest, which falls in this legal area, the gray area, where it is federal land, has to abide by federal laws. So technically the kratom trees in it are illegal, but it's a federal land, federally protected park where it's illegal to cut down any tree within it. And so by nature that, this one park in Thailand is the one place where the once abundant kratom tree is still naturally occurring in old growth formation. But thankfully, Thailand re-legalized kratom along with cannabis in 2021. And so now what was once the center of kratom culture for many hundreds of years is now returning to the forefront and trying to claw its way past Indonesia as a major commercial kratom exporter. But that is, by way of analogy, perhaps why kratom is so controversial, because it has this monopoly breaking effect, the hold of opioids on a population historically in Thailand, without making any conspiratorial claims as to why it might be controversial in the United States today.
Yeah, and like I think there's a more benign, well, insidious and maybe like benign seeming approach that happens often too, is anything new that's not studied, we'd say, oh, we don't know if it's safe, even though there's a long history of traditional use. And politicians like easy wins for in saying, you know, for whatever reason, being tough on the war on drugs is like still a really viable political strategy. So I think there's a lot of strange nonsense there. And,
I agree.
Complicated for sure.
So many variables, so many factors, which is one of the reasons why I like to be cautious when theorizing as to why kratom is in its place today, because even if there were a memo from the Attorney General saying we need to make kratom illegal because of the re-election or whatever, I don't even think that would be enough to, say that this is the one and only reason why there is a controversy regarding this. There's just so many factors at play.
Now, just to be full spectrum here, like what does like a really problematic relationship look like with kratom?
Sure. It can look like a problematic relationship with anything, and not just substances. You can fall into, and this is just really the understanding of addiction that I operate with, is a mindless action, one that you engage in without really thinking about it first, without bringing your awareness into the process. It's like an automated process. And my analogy for this is like I had to delete Instagram on my phone because I would kind of wake up and be like, oh, I'm on Instagram. How did I get on this? And then exit out of it, which was like a mindless activity that was repetitive and that I found to be self-destructive. So I think any mindless, repetitive, and self-destructive activity is something that you need to be aware of. And I think you can fall into that with coffee. You can fall into that with cigarettes. You can fall into that with cannabis. You can fall into that with LSD, psilocybin, and you can certainly fall into that with kratom. And I think those are the things you just need to caution yourself with. And so I think that some of the more problematic relationships that people can fall into with kratom often come from not having a holistic understanding of what kratom is and how to get the best effects from it. Because it has sort of a ceiling to it based on the theories that are floating around about the pharmacological principles behind how kratom works in the brain. It has a ceiling effect related to there being agonist and antagonist present at the same time. You doesn't really make sense from our understanding of kratom at this point in time to take more, because eventually it'll kind of start to cancel itself out, and you'll just start to you'll start to see side effects become more apparent, and it's imbalanced to the positive effects that you would get from taking more. So there, there's really perhaps one case of a kratom only overdose that has some level of credibility to it, and that was from, I believe, a bodybuilder who was pressing kratom powder into like protein bars and then eating the dry powder at 100-gram plus amounts a couple times a day, and had some sort of toxicity effect that may or may not have resulted in his death. But really, outside of that, there's, it's the information regarding kratom toxicity and deleterious effects as a result of kratom by itself alone is few and far between. People can have unhealthy relationships with cannabis too, but it's just one of those things where it doesn't make much sense to blame cannabis for someone being stoned out of their mind all day and then not accomplishing tasks or fulfilling social obligations. There's probably a balance between, yes, perhaps the sedating effects of cannabis, but also with sublimated traumas and a lack of motivation within the individual itself that are being projected upon a plant. So I don't know if it might have been too political of an answer, but of course, it's possible to fall into a bad relationship with kratom, but it's not something that, if you would have asked me that about heroin, I probably would have the same response, though, to be honest. I don't think you can blame a lot of people's individual issues on heroin or society's issues on heroin alone. I think a lot of time it's just the scapegoat for a deeper, harder question.
Right. It's an easy critique to go at a substance than it is to go at like the structural design of your government and community. And yeah, it's a lot easier to scapegoat substance. And we see this all over the place, right? We just blame the wrong things for these causes, and it gets political attention because it's an easy, digestible answer. I think what Carl Hart's book did was really break down a lot of those root causes, and elucidated, how safe drugs can be. Drugs and substance carry risk for sure, but does that mean we should, put people in prison? No, in my opinion. So yeah, it's interesting. So like what kind of applications are you seeing people use kratom for?
Yeah. So, that kind of varies across the spectrum of kratom products. For our tea bags, which is definitely a bit more mild of a formulation than something like an extract shot, where you're getting the equivalent of 20, 50 grams of kratom plant matter compressed into, 500 milligram product that you can take all at once. So for our milder formulation, primarily people use it as like a caffeine alternative, for energy, for focus, slight, mood heightening effects. But at higher levels, you can assume that maybe 2 or 3 servings, several tea bags. We hear a lot of people saying that they have it before they go to bed, They have it as a recovery beverage if there's any sort of aches or pains that they're having or following a workout. Kratom actually kind of kicked off in the United States in a major way, first among the bodybuilding community, and people were consuming Kratom as a pre-workout, which I am especially fond of. I really enjoy having a Kratom tea before I go rock climbing. I just really find it helps with my focus, kind of helps calm me down, get me in the right headspace, give me some good energy, and gives me a little bit more. Um, it like makes my calluses thicker. My hands aren't as worn and tired and inflamed and painful halfway through a route as if I just had a cup of coffee or nothing beforehand. So it really just has this wide spectrum of use. Yeah, and many people just kind of use it as more or less like a wellness supplement, sometimes for very general purpose without a specific goal in mind. It kind of has crossover with cannabis in that aspect. In Thailand, culturally, it's been used primarily among laborers, people in the field. Like today, it's the area. It's a lot of rubber fields, and so people are outside in the tropical heat and sun all day, and they chew on kratom leaves like we would a cup of coffee in the United States. And they say, it gives them energy to be more productive, and it gives them more resilience against beating sun and fatigue, and aches and pains related with being a blue-collared laborer who works 12 hours 7 days a week for decades.
I see the analogy there with rock climbing. One more cute than the other. Yeah.
What's your?
Go ahead.
What's your like? When do you reach for a cup of kratom tea or some powder? I mean, before we started recording,
I'm looking for a little diversity. Outside of coffee, it's infrequent, but I still like it. Like the flavor is really nice. Like we had the flavor conversation before. Like eventually you actually really start to enjoy the hell out of it, and I'm enjoying it right now. But it's more stimulant. I've not used it before a workout yet, though I will. I'm curious about like the half-life. So coffee, obviously, really long chemical half-life with caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any like data, or do you know much about like the comparative half-life or like the experienced kind of decline of effect from substance for this stuff?
Yeah. So, similar to coffee, kratom is metabolized, or the class of enzymes that metabolize kratom are mediated through cytochrome P450 and a subclass C3A4, which breaks down kratom alkaloids, and it's a similar enzymatic process that breaks down probably like 80% of everything that we consume, and it is genetically varied. If you take like a 23andMe test, it'll tell you whether or not you're classified as a fast drug metabolizer or not, and this is the class of enzymes that they're looking at, and the genes that express it to tell you this. And so a lot of this depends on individual psychology or physiology and your genetic makeup. But for most people and most experience reports, kratom is kind of peak obviousness for 3 to 4 hours following consumption. And unlike coffee, I've not found it to interrupt my sleep. That's one of the reasons why I loved using it so much as in college, is because I was able to, instead of taking a half a caffeine pill or like 50 to 100 milligrams of caffeine at midnight because I had a paper that was due at 7 a.m. the next day I had to turn in, and I would knock it out by 2 a.m., but then be just unable to sleep because of the caffeine. I'd have Kratom tea at 10 p.m., midnight, maybe 1:30. I finish up at 2, and I'm in bed by 2:30 without kind of any interruption of my sleep, but still having, increased concentration, which is something that I'm really appreciative of Kratom for. It's just so much of the negative effects of those classic stimulants like coffee was related to lack of sleep and not the drug itself, using it in an improper manner. So yeah, about 3 to 4 hours, very simply put, is about how long a cup of Kratom tea would last you.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Some people have impacts to their sleep with coffee, even 8 hours after the last cup, sometimes even more. So,
Yeah.
For people, with that kind of an issue, it could be an interesting thing to experiment with. Yeah. So that's interesting. I will check that out more when I need a late in the day thing, because I really love green tea, but I'm just also kind of hesitant around the length of stay, the tenure
Yeah,
of the
absolutely.
caffeine molecule, keep me awake.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, I think a lot of the literature says caffeine has a half-life of 12 hours, which experientially it
that's
doesn't
crazy.
feel like it checks for me. But I mean, definitely some people that I know are extremely sensitive to it. And whenever I can be very responsible with myself, I don't consume coffee after 2 p.m. I'll drink my last cup of coffee around 1, maybe my second cup of coffee for the day. And then if I'm just super busy, I'll start brewing and drinking Kratom tea around 4 or 5 p.m., just as an energy booster. And I can drink that till 10 p.m. and still be in bed by 11:30.
I like it. Yeah, that 2 p.m. number kind of tracks for me too. Um, yeah, so it's interesting. Now, what's been going on politically around this plant? Like we see regularly that there might be some sort of international prohibition.
Hmm.
Like it seems like people are just being blowhards trying to like get some attention on themselves. But what is happening out there?
Yeah. So this kind of increased politicalization of Kratom really started in the United States around 2016 when the DEA announced that they would schedule Kratom as a Schedule 1 substance, putting it up there with cannabis, heroin, LSD, psilocybin, um, which in the eyes of the law are dangerous, no possible medical or therapeutic effect, highly addictive and disruptive to society, criminalized upon like the first offense, just worst case prohibitionist classification. And so, how a drug becomes made illegal generally is that the DEA, in its unilateral executive powers, makes a decision. Hey, here's a substance we don't like. We're going to put it on the public bulletin board called the Federal Register and announce that this compound will be made illegal in a month from the date of posting. If you have any industry or personal or scientific claims or arguments to be made regarding this, you can submit them for our consideration. There are 40, 50, sometimes 100 drugs that are made illegal and scheduled every single year through this process. At best, you get two, three, a dozen comments left on here, and they're more or less ignored. They're made illegal. This is just the machinery of prohibition trudging forward. You have offices and buildings just filled with people whose jobs rely on drugs being made illegal, and they do a pretty good job of continuing to make drugs illegal. Like their jobs depend on it. And they kind of likely thought that Kratom would just follow the same trajectory. So 2016, they announced the impending scheduling of Kratom, and a first of its kind ensued. You had hundreds of thousands of people leaving passionate, 99% positive comments on the Federal Register. You had petitions with 70,000 plus people going on whitehouse.org. You had 22 senators and congresspeople, including Bernie Sanders, writing to the DEA saying, we have so many constituents writing to us, begging us not to make this plant illegal because it helps them so much. And in the final hour before Kratom was made illegal, the DEA retracts its impending scheduling notice for the first and only time in the history of a drug being made illegal. The DEA said, whoops, sorry, never mind. And Kratom stopped the wheels of the prohibitionist machine. And really, that's the only time that has ever happened. And the recent blog I wrote for your all site was, trying to digest as many lessons from that as possible in order to extrapolate to prohibition at large, and specifically for your audience, psychedelic prohibition, which is still happening in full force today. It's insane. You have 20 plus.
Can you explain that recent thing Hamilton worked on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Around this, and he got a lot of publicity going.
Yeah, absolutely, he did. So there's publicly traded companies that are making millions off of psychedelics, or raising millions of money with the hopes of making billions around psychedelics, and yet psychedelics are still being made illegal. There was an announcement that 5-methoxy, MIPT, a couple different hydroxy, 4-hydroxy, 5-methoxy substituted tryptamines, as well as the base tryptamine DIPT, were made illegal in the Federal Register notice. And then a month following that, prior to the scheduling of those compounds, they announced that these extremely beneficial psychedelic phenethylamines, DOI, DOC, were also going to be made illegal, which DOB is possibly the most cited psychedelic on Google Scholar of all time. It's used in over 2,000 studies because it just has really high selectivity for 1A, 2B, 2A serotonin receptors. And so people use it, in figuring out displacement of other psychedelics, of other serotonin-rich compounds, figuring out physiological responses in mice like head twitch, low lip retraction, things like that related to these responses. It's really also not all that pleasurable of a substance. And so it doesn't really leak out of the lab all that often. And so in making this illegal, you would only be hurting research on psychedelics. So to kind of wrap it up, there's these two still pending attempts to prohibit psychedelics, the DIPT and other substituted tryptamines, and then the phenethylamine DOB compounds that are also trying to be made illegal. And Hamilton has, with a couple of friends and also some industry partners, some startups that have stakes in it, have filed suits with the DEA and are in the process of suing the DEA and in court filing action and litigating against the DEA to try to stop the scheduling of these compounds. And Hamilton was able to raise awareness. They probably got over 500 comments on the Federal Register regarding DIPT and those compounds. But that's unfortunately nowhere near the 100,000 number that worked for Kratom. But essentially, Kratom has the roadmap for how to stop prohibition of a substance that's announced. And I think that it should have more attention, that people should take more lessons from the one successful instance of overturning a ban and apply it to the bans that are currently ongoing now. in regards to psychedelics, which I also think is not getting enough attention. I think there's way too much pedantic infighting regarding whether or not a control was properly done, or whether or not there's a statistical variance, or whether or not you're allowed to patent a certain polymorph of psilocybin despite people still being put in cages for possessing psilocybin, preventing, or how should medicalization be properly and ethically imbued. These are all questions that have their time and place, but they're trying to make psychedelics illegal. They're trying to get it to a point where researchers who are using DOB will go to jail. I think these are very important things that people should be more focused on and talking about right now, and trying to distill any sort of anti-prohibitionist lessons anywhere that they can be found to halt this. And yes, Hamilton is working tirelessly on this with Mike Cunningham, a researcher from Columbia, with Jason Wallach, Hamilton's longtime chemist collaborator, a couple other industry partners who unfortunately I can't remember right now, to try to prevent this prohibition. And if any listener, also feels similarly impassioned about psychedelics not being made illegal, I recommend that they write their congressperson, they sign petitions, they leave comments on the Federal Register. I can send you links to this stuff following this so people can easily follow it. And just, let people know that you think it's ridiculous that psychedelics are still being made illegal today, when it seems in almost everyone's mind that we've turned a corner in a post-prohibitionist psychedelic renaissance right now, which is just not registering with the DEA, which for a lot of people is all that matters, because the DEA is who decides whether or not you go to a cage for the rest of your life because you decided to induce a novel state of consciousness. Prohibition, man.
Here. Well, you've come to the right podcast. So, it's outrageous, and like the fact that this is people's jobs is to make more things illegal is unbelievable. Before even they've been identified as a threat. So there's like barely any science happening with our policy. It's
none. Yeah.
What I've noticed quite a bit. And we really need to do a better job of science-based policy. Starting with that David Nutt study in the Lancet on relative drug harms. Let's start there. David Nutt says let's immediately decriminalize, if not legalize, everything safer than alcohol, I believe, and then go from there.
A lot.
And right. That's just about everything. So, how do we do that? It's going to be a long project. Hey, so we didn't actually even identify your relationship with Hamilton. Can you speak to that briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I got back from the Amazon, I was very interested in this field. I had been familiar with Hamilton's work, and kind of by, a bunch of lucky sort of connections and comings together, I was able to start working with Hamilton for the duration of my senior year at Columbia. He's in Brooklyn, so it was very easy to just hop on a train and go over to Brooklyn and then work with him in his apartment. And then it timed up perfectly with my graduating. The renewal of Pharmacopeia for season 3 started, and so I worked as a researcher producer for Hamilton for all of season 3 of Pharmacopeia, which was just truly one of the most important and influential learning experiences of my entire life. It was a master's class and a grad course all wrapped into one, for film, for journalism, for pharmacology and chemistry and drug culture and history. So I was really just a sponge for the year and a half of working on that with him. And turns out we work really well together, and I've just maintained a very close relationship with Hamilton ever since. And I produce his podcasts, which can be found on Patreon and YouTube and Spotify, Apple Music, the Hamilton Morris podcast today, and am in touch with him quite frequently, just helping him with all these wonderful, very important anti-prohibitionist projects that he's working on. So he is like a teacher and
Him.
mentor to me.
That's helpful. That's helpful and great to know. Um, Hamilton did a really great job at Bicycle Day, representing that stance, because there's some really weird rhetoric going on in San Francisco at that event. And he, really brave being able to stand up and say what he actually believes when it's a lot of people don't like even discussing, like all of the complexity around taking money from billionaires in order to get great science. An actual prohibition, like anti-prohibition stance. Like there's so much there. And like, how do we keep people safe? He is a really great champion in my mind around all of these topics. And yeah, it's unfortunate he's not getting, like, very well respected in the space, but people seem to like to not agree wholeheartedly. And it seems to me for reasons that aren't necessarily about critical thinking. Like, you didn't really do a lot of thinking to come to that conclusion. You just kind of jumped on a pretty bandwagon. That's how I see it. I'm going to piss a lot of people off saying that. So you're welcome, everybody. But I don't know. Any reaction to that kind of rant there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a new. I mean, we have turned a corner into a new paradigm of discussing drugs and psychedelics. It's kind of hard to pinpoint it, but it probably aligns pretty closely to Michael Pollan releasing How to Change Your Mind in 2018, just kind of opening up the conversation for psychedelics and drugs and getting a lot of industry and moneyed attention in on it, and convincing a lot of the people that in our oligarchy, in our society ruled by the opinion of few, that the medicalization of psychedelics could be commercially profitable and have positive medical value. And then the way we medicalize things in this country is, through billion-dollar clinical trials that essentially have to be paid for by pharmaceutical companies, people with these giant bank accounts, which, I makes sense why people are frustrated at, especially, following the 2016 rhetoric of like the Bernie campaign, where, a lot of people are angry at pharmaceutical greed and, Martin Shkreli type actors who, capitalize on human suffering. And people have this sense that psychedelics, shouldn't fit within that paradigm. People should not be able to capitalize on human suffering in order to make a buck, and they don't want psychedelics to fall into that. And I understand that completely, but that's one of the things about life, is that it is so complex. And then you, unfortunately, without there being a complete social disruption and revolution of the way we do everything, you have to balance, the possibility that pharmaceutical companies will profit off of psychedelics with the fact that there are good people in cages rotting because of drugs. And it is a hard question that requires a lot of, careful thought. And it's difficult, and it's easy to just pick one of the easy arguments from either of these sides and stick with it without weighing the nuance of the other. And I think that's where a lot of Hamilton's frustrations come from, is that if he wants to engage in these conversations and these arguments about where psychedelics are today and where it's going, is that people will just pick one side of this and then refuse to hear the nuances of the other. And so, yes, like, injecting greed and profitability models into psychedelics is probably not what would happen in a perfect utopia. But trying to stick a stick in the wheel and disrupt the whole momentum of medicalizing psychedelics and, bringing them from Schedule 1 classification to a lighter scheduling category, would have so much positive social ramifications as well. And yes, people will probably be enriching themselves from it. And that's unsavory. It doesn't sit well in a lot of people's mouths, but it's just complex. And unfortunately, too, a lot of these arguments seem to be biased by funding from one actor or another with some sort of, pawn in the game somehow. And then that's just what really, makes it hard to figure out what's actually going on here. It's because it's hard to trust journalists these days and what they're talking about. Where are your biases? Where is your money coming from? What do you have to gain from your side of a complex issue being the dominant one? And yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't want to speak for Hamilton on this. He talks about this a lot with me. But it is such a vast and complex issue with so much emotions floating around that, I think that this is my perception of it. It's just complex to the bone. It's so nuanced.
Yeah.
I know that you kind of got wrapped up in a lot of this debate as well in the movement of psychedelics, like being medicalized. Like how has that affected your philosophy? Yeah,
it's really disheartening. I see people suffering, killing themselves. The world's in shambles, and the rhetoric around let's move slower so we can get it right. Well, how many people commit suicide daily, and or just continue to suffer with PTSD, and or continue to play out 1 to 50-year sentences, if not multiple lifetime sentences, and they didn't hurt a fly. Like, what is this? And how is this conscionable rhetoric? Like, we need to get these political prisoners out of jail. We need to help as many people as we can. And I'm a pragmatist, and I say, these people who are pushing back, they're not the people trying to buy guns to revolt. They're just stirring up shit that seems to slow down how many people we can heal quickly. Like you said, unless we get into a really disrupted political state for a long time and a lot more people suffer, we're not going to solve this kind of capitalist quagmire we're in. So we need to work within it unless people are trying to overthrow it. And, I'm not necessarily down for that. Consent is still important, even when it comes to revolutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unless revolution is the exception to consent and you're totally justified to do anything, which some groups out there are playing that card. So
all things are fair in love and war.
I prefer kindness, compassion, curiosity, and let's try to help as many people as possible, because we need these people back, because we need to really work hard to keep the planet afloat. So everybody needs to come back and help.
Yeah. I agree completely.
Try not to go too far with what I say.
I agree.
Beautiful. So anything else you want to throw in? We're a bit over time, but I'm just kind of curious if there's any kind of closing remarks you might want to put out there, or links or anything else like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think conversations like these and the conversations that you host frequently through your fantastic company and media outlet, Psychedelics Today, are very important. I think normalizing drug use and use of traditional plant compounds and trying things in curiosity and talking about something despite there being a possible social stigma are all hard, but things that have to be done in order to get us into a post-prohibitionist paradigm. So that's kind of the mission of Top Tree Herbs. Our Kratom tea bag company is kind of taking the lessons of Hart and Hamilton, people who are not afraid to talk about it, who have bravery, and stick their neck out there for what they believe in. That's essentially the mission statement of Top Tree Herbs. We want to educate people on kratom so that they know how to use it as effectually and safely as possible in a very normal seeming manner of a tea bags in a thermos, in a way that you would not be, afraid to do at work or in public or in front of your folks or friends or whatever. And so our goal is to normalize and to educate and, talking about it and putting it in, I think, tea bag forms. That's our idea right now. That's what we're trying to do to help these people who find so much benefit from kratom. Myself, one of them, but many millions of others, count on this plant every day, and we're just trying to keep it out there, keep it available for people, and have people not afraid to use it. They don't not lose their job, not lose their kids, not lose their freedom for using it. And that's our mission. And as soon as kratom seems like it's in a safe position from that, it's on to the next one until prohibition is just a reprehensible chapter in our history that we look back on and go, wow, glad we're not dealing with that anymore. So I really appreciate having this conversation with me and giving us this outlet to talk about these difficult conversations, which I think, thankfully, are becoming more and more permissible every single day, thanks to we're standing on the shoulders of many of the giants of the 60s and contemporaries today, like Hart and Hamilton, and I salute them, very thankful for them. And Joe, you're very quickly becoming one of those people, sticking your neck out there regularly and giving people a platform. And I think we all appreciate that. If we're listening to this right now, I think we all appreciate that. Yeah.
Thanks for saying that, Soren. And I'm really there's one final thing. Can you speak about the farm?
Sure. Like
where you're growing?
Yeah. So yeah. So most of our kratom that we use in our tea bags comes from Indonesia. That's just the major commercial giant right now. But we are working with a local, to me, an Appalachia greenhouse, growing kratom trees. They're about 3 years old right now, and trying to figure out a way to make more traditional kratom products available. So whole leaf, perhaps not even dehydrated kratom, so people can have the experience of chewing it, which is, I think, very novel from the effect you get from swallowing kratom or having a tea bag, but also as a way to, trying to be very environmentally conscious, try to reduce trip around the world to get our plant products to us and to each other, and opening up the American growing market is something that's important to us. We have close collaborators at the University of Florida who are doing even better research on how to standardize a commercial product. That stuff's kind of spearheaded by Brian Pearson at University of Florida, who's a close collaborator with Dr. Oliver Grundman, who you all have had on the show before, as well as Dr. Chris McCurdy. And I do believe that there's also some kratom farms that are popping up in Mexico, as well as on the Atlantic coast of Africa. There's farms that are popping up all over there, which is slightly closer to the US than Indonesia. But the world's opening up, and I think there's going to be some shuffling, and then quickly we'll find ourselves in a place with domestic kratom available to everyone who wants it. Ours is still very small batch, hands-on. I have gloves and pick every single leaf that anyone has available from American grown kratom through us. So it hasn't really scaled yet, but it's just one of the many things that we're trying to innovate on. And also just because people are so accustomed to seeing kratom in a plastic bag, in a powder, in a head shop, so many people are alienated from the true natural form, that it is a tree leaf. And just getting that product image out there to a lot of people, I think, has deepened the connection that they have with this plant that they find benefits from.
Brilliant. Well, Soren, thank you for that. Everybody check out Top Tree Herbs. Check out that podcast with Oliver Grunman. It's mind-blowing as well. And Soren's recent blog on our site, The Intertwined Prohibitionist Histories of Psychedelics and Kratom, came out last month, June. So brilliant. Soren, really appreciate you coming on. Thanks for the kind words, and thanks for being another soldier in the fight.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. This was wonderful chat. I hope we stay close contact over the coming weeks and months, and enjoy your weekend, man.